Hello, everyone. Welcome to the official opening of the 43rd Annual NACIS meeting. I am Brooke Marston, the Vice President of NACIS and co-organizer of NACIS 2023 in Pittsburgh. The last time we were here was almost a decade ago. It was 2014. And if you want to learn some fun Pittsburgh trivia, please check out the crossword in the print program. So I'd like to go ahead and kick things off by thanking the volunteers and board members who helped make this all possible, and a special note of appreciation to Hannah Dormito, Luganart, and Nathaniel Douglas for organizing this year's Practical Cartography Day. And thank you, of course, to all of the PCD speakers for sharing your insights and helping to broaden our collective knowledge of cartography today. For those of you who arrived early on Tuesday, we hope you had a chance to join the Tuesday night meetup at Shorty's. A very big thank you to our local coordinator, city tour guide, and primo selfie taker, Eric Breeden, for making our members feel very welcome here in Pittsburgh. The annual meeting is when we come together and talk about all things maps. We reconnect with our old friends, we make new friends, and we discuss the past and the present and the future of our discipline. And you all have set the bar really high in 2023. The slate of presentations over the next 2 days is just really stellar. You all are the heart of NACIS. Without you and your participation, we'd just be a bunch of map enthusiasts that never traded Daniel Huffman's map projection cards to make a full set or make maps from wasabi peas with Anton Thomas over dinner. So thank you all for being here. Before I introduce our keynote speaker, I have a few announcements about what the next 2 days is going to look like. So this evening, please join us immediately after the keynote for a reception and the opening of the map gallery. The map gallery, if you head out the doors in the back and take a left, is going to be in the room that's right next to us over here. Some of the maps are entered in the student map competition, so please vote. There are QR codes next to the maps and on tables, so please use your phone to vote for our students and see how they do in the map competition. Sessions will begin tomorrow at 9 a.m. Tomorrow's lunch is the NACIS annual business meeting, where we'll go over the whole last year and what it has meant for our organization, as well as present the board election results. So lunch is included in your registration, so please come and enjoy the taco bar and learn about the work the board is doing for the society. Oops, sorry about that. Thursday is NACIS Night Out at Sly Fox Brewery at the Highline. If you head out the lobby doors and turn left, it's about a 20-minute walk from here on this side of the river. If you cross the bridge, you are going to a different Sly Fox Brewery. Please turn around. There are multiple ones in Pittsburgh. We are looking for the Sly Fox at the Highline. The 9th annual Fun Run and Walk is also on Thursday. It is at 5:30 p.m. It's going to be hosted by Carl Sack again. There's plenty of time to do both and enjoy NACIS Night Out afterwards. The route that Carl's planned this year will have some really spectacular views of the city, and Carl has a lot more information about the cost to go up the incline. There are a couple of different routes you can do, one for the running and a couple of different difficulties for the walking. So he's going to provide more information about that at a later time, but just keep that on your radar. It's 5:30 tomorrow evening before NACIS Night Out. And the awards will be announced at our Friday night banquet, which is followed by GeoDweeb Jeopardy, hosted by NACIS's very own Art Fleming, Dennis McClendon. On Thursday and Friday, you have the chance to participate in NACIS Commons. There's a sign-up sheet at the registration desk where you can propose topics and peruse different sessions that have been offered that you might want to join. The NACIS Commons is an effort to allow you to talk about emerging ideas, gather cartographers of a given persuasion or anything else you would like to try outside of a more formal session. Our annual GeoScavenge Challenge is also now open. You can pick up your map at the registration desk starting tomorrow. If you hand that back into the registration desk by 3 p.m. and earn at least 100 points, you can win a prize during the Friday banquet. And I also encourage everyone, and especially our newcomers, to sign up for a lunch bunch group on Friday. We've reserved tables at several nearby restaurants, and each group is led by a veteran NACIS member. It's a really great opportunity to discuss anything that might come up, to network, to be social, to get to know people. I highly recommend it. It often fills up very quickly. So when that sign-up sheet goes out tomorrow, if you're interested, I recommend that you sign up early. We also have 2 workshops on Saturday and a field trip Saturday evening. The workshops require a registration. The details about all these events are in the program, the print program, as well as SCED. And speaking of SCED, there have been quite a few schedule changes, even since we sent the program to the printer just a few weeks ago at the very end of September. So please check SCED for the definitive lineup and session rooms. Some of these have already moved as recently as yesterday. So SCED is going to be what you want to use for figuring out which sessions are where and when. Our NACIS shop coordinator, Rebecca Ramsey, will be manning the shop, which is at the registration desk, Thursday and Friday from 8 to 9 in the morning, and then Thursday and Friday evening from 5 to 6 p.m. So be sure to swing by, snag your 2023 Pittsburgh t-shirt. There are some one-of-a-kind enamel pins, and there's also a NACIS is NICIS sticker that is available. All the items in the shop are designed by NACIS members, and the sales provide support for student travel grants, contest awards, video recording. So not only do they add some fun geographic charm to your life, but the proceeds go towards some really great NACIS initiatives. Travis covered the code of conduct in depth at the start of PCD. Please be nice and respectful to your fellow attendees. If you experience or witness any harassing behavior, there are 3 options for how to report it. You can submit a written report to the NACIS Ethics Committee by sending an email to reporting@nacis.org. You can complete the misconduct report form, which is on nacis.org, or you can speak directly with a trusted NACIS board member. All the board members have a red sticker on their badges. So we have a wonderfully diverse lineup of sessions and speakers this week, including many new academics, young professionals, and panelists. For some of us, this may be your first NACIS experience. New attendees have a dark green sticker on their badge. Please go introduce yourself and make it a goal to talk to them and help them feel welcome. We were all new to NACIS at one point, and a large reason so many of us keep coming back, other than the fact that you guys just really can't take a hint, but also for the friendships. So be that person to someone new. We hope you have an engaging and respectful discourse this week, and enjoy yourselves and have fun. So now I am very pleased to welcome Peng Shepherd as our opening keynote speaker. Peng is the nationally best-selling, award-winning author of The Cartographers, The Book of M, and the forthcoming All This and More. Her novels have been named a Best Book of the Year by the Washington Post and a Best Book of the Summer by the Today Show and NPR, as well as featured in the New York Times, the LA Times, Good Morning America, and more. Her work has been translated into over 10 languages and optioned for TV and film. She was born in Phoenix, Arizona, where she rode horses and trained in classical ballet, and has lived in Beijing, Kuala Lumpur, London, Mexico City, and New York. Her talk this evening is Crafting a Cartography Mystery, Seeking the Truth About Maps Through Fiction. Peng joins us to share her experience writing The Cartographers, a mystery novel based on a 1930s map containing a New York phantom settlement which took on a life of its own. She will discuss what the journey taught her about writing fiction and creating maps, and how the 2 disciplines are much more similar than they might first appear. Please help me welcome Peng Shepherd.
Hi, I hope I'm on. Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of your 43rd annual meeting. It's really an honor to be speaking to all of you. And I apologize. I wish that I could be there in person with you tonight, but we have technology at least. And I can't wait to see pictures of the conference on online and on social media. Now, there's no way that I'm going to be able to tell you all more about maps than you already know, because you are the experts and I'm just an enthusiast. But what I can tell you about is my own personal love of maps and how I've used them in my own life, what they've meant to me, and how a chance encounter with an unassuming little map sent me down a 7-year rabbit hole into history, cartography, and phantom settlements, and ended up as the star of my latest book. I'm imagining that for many of you, your path to cartography is similar. Maybe it goes something like this. You've been fascinated with maps from a young age and couldn't resist studying every one you came across. Maybe you would beg to play with your parents' driving maps whenever you were in the car, or you would pore over every old coffee table atlas you could find at your grandparents' houses. Eventually, you had the big light bulb moment. You realized that all of these beautiful, interesting maps didn't just appear out of thin air. Someone, somewhere, was making them. And that someone maybe could be you. My own journey to becoming an author followed this same trajectory. Just the way you all love maps, I love books. A little disclaimer, by the way, some of the photos in my slideshow are, they're pretty old, so the quality like this one might not be great at this size, so just bear with me. I deal in words, not in images. So my mother says, as you can see, that I began reading early and first started trying to write my own stories when I was in kindergarten. I was also obsessed with bugs. So basically every story was about bugs at this point. And my mom, being a good mom, encouraged my interests in both literature and entomology. And so she was often my first reader. I'd finish a story, illustrate it myself, of course, and then proudly give her the messy, colorful, confusing pages to read. One night, my 6-year-old self came to the dinner table and presented my first book about a spider who just wants to make friends, but to his dismay, everyone is afraid of him. His name was Webster. Get it? Like Webster, because he's a spider and he has a web. I thought I was 6. I thought I was so clever. So after I showed my mother, I was already on to the next project, but she sensed an opportunity. The next day, she snuck my project to her office, where she laminated the pages and she bound them with a spiral spine, like you can see in the photo. And that evening, when she got home from work, she called me over and she showed me the laminated and bound book. And I thought I had been published. If only it were that easy, right? I eventually outgrew this love of bugs, but not my love of fiction. I kept writing all through middle school, then high school, and then after university. And somewhere along the way, I also fell in love with maps. At first, it was because I was fascinated with Taiwan, which is where my mother's side of the family is from. When my mom was about 4 or 5, my grandmother came to the United States with her, and they settled in Montana, where they were the only Chinese family in their small town. And my mother eventually left to attend university, but nearly every holiday, she dutifully took my brother and I back to Montana to visit. And my brother was all about the snow, which was not something that we ever saw growing up in Arizona. But I relished those trips because of the stories. Our family's circumstances in Taiwan had been difficult, and so it often took some coaxing. But before the end of each visit, my grandmother would tell me more about a place from which I knew a part of me had come, but had yet to see with my own eyes, and speak to me in a language whose words I was familiar with, but never used anywhere but in her home. After these stories, I'd go to the cheap old globe that she kept on one of the bookshelves in the guest room, and I would spin it around to see the little island floating just off the southeast coast of China's vast rooster-like shape, trying to understand where we'd come from, how far away it was, and where we were now. So while that was where my initial fascination with maps sparked, it wasn't until I grew up and started going abroad as a young adult that I really began to understand their power. About 20 years ago, I was in university, finishing my bachelor's degree. After a childhood full of my grandmother's stories, I'd grown into an avid traveler. But like most college students, I was also stereotypically broke. And so my main hobby was trying to figure out how to stretch dollars for cheap plane tickets and beds in youth hostels. And if you think back to that time, 20 years ago, smartphones weren't really that common yet, and Google Maps hadn't even been launched. And it was still paper maps like the ones in the pictures, or more importantly, chunky paperback guidebooks like Lonely Planet that were the default mode of navigating foreign cities. I distinctly remember going into the travel section at a bookstore ahead of a flight to comb every shelf for a colorful spine with the name of the right city that I was heading to, like Casablanca, Madrid, Istanbul, Tokyo. And then upon finding the right edition for the right place, I would rush home with my new prize to pore over it, underlining interesting cafes and dog-earing pages of zoomed in sections of the map. Luckily, my friends also love to travel. And since those books were really expensive for students, we would often share our copies of Lonely Planet between each other to save money. I took Krista's Lisbon guidebook. This is Krista, by the way. I took her Lisbon guidebook to a weekend getaway in Portugal. And Igaram borrowed my Shanghai book for a visit to China, and so on. And at first, it was purely practical, simply about saving what little cash we had for each of our travels. But after a while, lending our books to each other became almost as rewarding as taking them on a trip for ourselves. Once we got a guidebook back from whoever we'd borrowed it from, we'd delight in seeing the marks they left behind in our copies. Crook loved to bike, and I loved following his penciled in routes of his favorite streets or through the plazas that were the most vibrant. And Jillian, this is Jillian always found the best restaurants in any city. And she would leave mouth-watering descriptions in the map's margins about exactly what she had ordered at every place, kind of like a secret menu just for us. But an even greater pleasure than reading about our friends' memories, we all discovered, was when another one of us would visit the same city after that and take the same guidebook. Getting to try that same delicious cheese that Jillian discovered, or being able to enjoy the same beautiful view of a palace or a plaza that Crook had found, made those moments even more meaningful. Their arrows around a map or notes on a page made us feel closer to each other, able to share some of the same experiences in the same place, even though we were actually very far apart. Then, Google Maps was invented. And more than a decade on, the navigation service has become nearly ubiquitous, and paper maps and guidebooks feel like a relic lost to time. And I admit, it's hard to resist the convenience and the safety of GPS when you're driving or when you're just simply somewhere unfamiliar. But as much as I appreciate the accuracy of electronic maps, I started to miss that closeness and shared joy that the paper versions used to give me. A small part of me worried that the magic of cartography, that feeling of mystery, of adventure, that I used to get every time I opened up a paper copy, had been lost forever. But then in the summer of 2016, I went to rural Mongolia. Mongolia's countryside is vast, beautiful, and isolated. Miles and miles of rugged, grassy steppes, dotted by the occasional tree, marmot hole, yurt, or yak herd. It's a rare place where even now, there's still no internet connection and no cell phone signal in remote areas. I lived at a nomad horse camp for a month, where I helped corral and saddle the horses from the herd that would be ridden that day, prepared some of the meals, cleaned some of the yurts, and took visitors on horse treks. One of the visitors was a professional photographer, which is where most of these Mongolia shots were from, including the great black and white one that was just up. But sometimes nomads from neighboring camps would come to visit, and we'd all eat and talk and joke together, but mostly we were on our own. Our yurts were hours from the nearest town, and a ride in to send an email, make a phone call, or post a letter required planning a week in advance. I couldn't remember the last time I'd been disconnected from technology for so long. These were the Nomad Camp's resident kittens. I'm not going to make you sit through a 45-minute speech without some cute cat photos. I'm not that cruel. So this is your reward. They were adorable. They got into every kind of trouble imaginable, like every kind of trouble. And they were only tolerated because their mother, who we called Mama, was responsible for keeping the camp marmot and mouse free. Even the horses loved them. So when I was there in Mongolia, it was the rainy season. And one day during a torrential monsoon, I ducked into the biggest yurt normally reserved for visitors. And I briefly tried mucking it out because the floor had become covered in mud over the course of the wet day, but it was still raining too hard. As I gave up, Mama, soaking wet, stalked inside and curled up on the rug to wait out the storm. She had the right idea, I thought. So I put the mop away and began to peruse the jumbled shelves against one curved fabric wall of the yurt. It was a case of curios, essentially, where the nomads would stick anything that the tourists gave them or forgot to take when they were leaving in case anyone else could make use of it. So there were old watches, flashlights without batteries, dirty baseball caps, useless charging cables, and a pile of musty paperback books. One of the musty paperback books, I realized, was a tattered, long outdated Lonely Planet guidebook for Mongolia. And that old, wonderful feeling at discovering a link to someone else who had once been where I was now came back to me suddenly, like a surprise reunion with an old friend. I took the guidebook down from the shelf, sat on the damp rug with Mama, and slowly opened the cover. All over the margins of every page, written by countless different hands, were notes. Stories of the horses, the weather, friendly nearby nomad families, safe routes, good food, adventures taken. I didn't know who all the travelers were who had left their marks in this book, or how old the notes were. But there was something very magical in that moment about seeing stories about the remote, austere landscape in which I had been passing through for weeks, reported by people who had come this way before me and who wanted to leave behind the tales of their experiences for others to find and share in. It was like making new friends, even though we were countries or years apart. Even after the storm had ended, I spent hours going through that guidebook page by page, the way I'd used to when I was young, relishing every scribble and note. I still remember this message in particular. The general area this other writer had circled on the map couldn't have been more than a few hours from ours by horseback. And on my first night with my nomad hosts, one of the youngest horsemen, a teenager named Munkundra, had invited me to sing by the fire. "Do you know the Beatles?" he'd asked excitedly. Sitting there, holding that battered, lonely planet, I wondered, had Buena taught Munkundra the words to Let It Be after learning it from this visitor, and then years later, Munkundra wanted to sing it with me? Maps are about orienting us in the world in more ways than just geographically. For me, a map's deepest purpose, just like fiction's, has always been about bringing people together. And that's what I want to talk about tonight, this connection between cartography and fiction. Now, those two themes might seem very different. In fact, they might seem like complete opposites of each other. Maps are supposed to tell the truth, and fiction is supposed to lie, right? Maybe. But sometimes the line blurs, whether by accident or design. There are maps out there with typos, inaccuracies, even outright mistakes on them. But there's another much more nuanced cartography term to describe a particular kind of error on a map: and many of you probably know it already, but despite my enthusiasm for maps, I'd never heard it until I came across the urban legend that sparked the inspiration for my novel, The Cartographers. That term is phantom settlement. Now, you might be guessing that when I heard this phrase, I was attending a lecture on maps or sitting in a geography department or something like that, but I wasn't. I was actually in a writing class. I was in grad school in New York City, earning an MFA in creative writing. Our studio component met once a week for workshop, which is an intense session in which everyone else in the class picks apart the chapter or story you've submitted a week prior until you think your head is going to pop off and roll away. I had a professor who would start every workshop by asking the group if any of us had read, seen, or heard anything unusual or interesting since the last meeting. And one fateful day, someone had a story about dictionaries. Esquivalience. Sounds like a real word, right? But have you ever actually heard anyone use it in conversation? That's because it is not a real word. Apparently, dictionary makers used to sneak in made-up entries and definitions into their editions as a way to catch other dictionary makers in the act of copying their work. These made-up entries have affectionately become known as Mount Weasels, after a woman named Lillian Virginia Mount Weasel, who was purported to have been a photographer in the 1960s. Except she didn't exist anywhere but within the pages of the 1975 edition of the New Columbia Encyclopedia. Here are a few more such fictitious entries. The first one, Yumftak, is supposed to be a type of Persian bird with only one wing, and so two of them must couple together in order to successfully take flight. The second is supposed to be a Maori word for drum, fife, and conclusion, despite the fact that the Maori language does not use J, Z, or X. And the third, an ancient game similar to football. So back to the writing workshop. I was already fascinated by this idea of dictionaries containing invented words right under our noses. And I was wondering if I could do something with that, writing-wise. But then someone else said, "Did you know that cartographers do the same thing?" Do what? My professor asked. Insert imaginary places into their maps? And it was like fireworks going off in my brain. Maps, hidden secrets on them, imaginary places, the two worlds that I loved, the world of cartography and the world of stories, coming together. I think my head did pop off and roll away at that point. And as soon as the workshop was over, I ran straight home to research. I went down a rabbit hole, reading all about phantom settlements, also called paper towns and trap streets, depending on the map maker. It turns out there are many of them that have been discovered over the years, but my favorite by far is the phantom settlement of Aglow in the middle of nowhere in upstate New York. And it isn't my favorite just because it's the closest one to where I live. It's because for a short, magical time, this particular phantom settlement became real. You may have heard this story, but in case you haven't, I'm going to tell it to you now, because this real-life history is as strange as any fiction. In the early 1900s, without satellite and GPS, map making was grueling, time-consuming work, as I am sure you're all familiar. And I don't mean it isn't still now, of course, but back then, whew. At that time, maps for general consumers were often sold as large frame pieces or in beautiful leather atlases, meant for display in a personal library as art almost as much as for use. But then the automobile was invented, and suddenly people could travel farther and faster in a single day than ever before, and something more convenient than a big, heavy leather atlas was needed. Two small-time New York City map makers, Otto G. Lindbergh and Ernest Alpers of General Drafting Corporation, saw their opportunity. They cornered the market on convenient foldable driving maps early, but they were terrified that their much larger competitors, like H.M. Goucher and Rand McNally, potentially could steal their work in order to catch up, and they were desperate for a way to protect themselves. So they created a phantom settlement. This way, if Otto and Ernest's tiny, secret phantom settlement turned up on one of their competitors' maps, they could prove copyright infringement, because the only way that could be possible is if the competitor stole Otto and Ernest's data, since a phantom settlement is an error, right? So while they were out surveying the countryside in rural upstate New York, Otto and Ernest came up with their plan. They invented a tiny town, hid it on their map at the place where they were standing in the middle of nowhere, and they told no one. They named it using a combination of their own initials, AGLOE, sort of like a secret signature. Time passed, and maybe a year later, their competitor Rand McNally released its own driving map of the same geographical area. To Otto and Ernest's surprise, they spotted their made-up town on Rand McNally's map. So they sued, claiming copyright infringement, because the only way that their town could be on Rand McNally's map is if Rand McNally had copied their work instead of doing their own land survey, yeah? Because if they had done their own land survey, they would have seen that there was nothing there in that place because the town wasn't real. Ah, Rand McNally said, but the town is real. Otto and Ernest had no idea what to make of that. So they and their lawyer, they got in a car and they drove out to the middle of nowhere in rural upstate New York, where they'd originally planted this fake town on their map, ready to take pictures of the empty land and claim their victory in court. But when they got there, they were stunned at what they found. There, where there should have been nothing at all, was a gas station, a general store, a fishing lodge, houses with people living in them, and an official town record in Delaware County administration logs with the same name that Otto and Ernest had made up from their own initials. A town that was not supposed to exist at all somehow did. Now, Agloe may be the most famous, but it is not the only such phantom settlement or quirk of cartography to have briefly come to life. There are plenty of other magical stories like this about maps with minds of their own, especially when you throw in modern technology. In West Lancashire, in the United Kingdom, a phantom settlement called Argleton appeared on Google Maps and Google Earth until about 2010. But because this phantom settlement was online and not on a paper map, and a lot of other online information services pull data from Google, those algorithms accidentally began treating Argleton as a real settlement within that postcode, which caused a lot of hilarious confusion when listings for businesses and residences in that area were suddenly relocated to Argleton, and their addresses changed to include the non-existent town's name. And in Potwin, Kansas, a mapping error turned the Vogelman family's once quiet farm into a strange nightmare for over a decade, until a journalist finally realized that in 2002, a digital mapping company in Massachusetts called MaxMind had made a very fateful rounding error in its new IP intelligence service. IP mapping can be very exact, but sometimes a city or a state, or even just a country, is as precise as you can get. The geographic center of the United States is in Kansas, right here. MaxMind decided to use these coordinates as the answer that its IP intelligence service would return for any IP address that could only be narrowed down to somewhere in the US, cleaned up just a little, which happens to be the front yard of the Vogelman's house. So for 14 years, every time MaxMind's database was queried about the location of an IP address in the United States that it couldn't identify, it gave the coordinates to the Vogelman's house, which lured everyone from people tracking stolen cell phones, IRS collectors, ambulances, and even FBI agents, all searching for a person or a belonging who wasn't really there, right to the poor resident's doorstep. By the time the journalist figured out what was going on and contacted MaxMind to fix the error, its database had associated over 600 million IP addresses with the Vogelman farm. And last, one of my favorites, The Sky on Trap Street, which is a small online project that collects photographs of the view of the sky where a mapping anomaly is located. Users use Google Street View or something similar to navigate as close as possible to the location of a phantom settlement or a trap street, and then they take a screenshot of the sky over the imaginary place. For many people, technology is often held in opposition to the old ways of map making because it seems to erase that sense of art and mystery, giving infinite detail and leaving nothing to the imagination. But sometimes technology creates a magic of its own. As I've learned more, I've come to love digital maps as much as paper maps in their own way because of strange occurrences like these. I'll stop bombarding you with anecdotes now, but suffice to say, that story that I heard in grad school about dictionaries fueled my obsessive research into phantom settlements for a long time. I even started searching for a copy of General Drafting Corporation's highway driving map from the 1920s and 1930s, hunting for an edition where the phantom settlement of Aglow was printed. I just wanted to hold the little mystery in my hands and see it with my own eyes. When I finally found one, which I bought off eBay from some online map seller for about $5, I opened it up and hung it on the wall where my writing desk sits. A month later, on some other website, I found another one and another. They were just so cheap at that point, and it was so fun to seek them out that I couldn't stop. I ended up with at least 6 copies of the map, which I still have, as you can see. There was just something about this concept that I couldn't let go of, this idea of how maps in the world meet and change each other, of how easily we all trust that maps tell the truth, but in fact, as we've just seen, they often don't, and what secrets might lie in that gap between what's visible in the world and what's drawn on the page. It took me 5 more years of research and collecting to realize that cartography and Aglow was clearly more than an obsession of mine. It was a novel. The Cartographers is a story about map making and family secrets. It follows a woman named Nell, a young scholar whose whole life and greatest passion is the art of cartography. Her father, the brilliant, domineering Dr. Daniel Young, is a legend in their field and Nell's personal hero. But she hasn't seen or spoken to him for almost a decade, ever since he fired her and destroyed her professional reputation after an argument over a seemingly worthless map in the New York Public Library's collection. But when her father is found dead in his office at the library with the very same map hidden away in his desk, Nell can't resist investigating. To her surprise, she soon discovers that this seemingly worthless map is actually incredibly valuable and exceedingly rare. So rare, in fact, that she may have the only copy left in existence, because a mysterious collector has been hunting down every last one, along with anyone who gets in the way. To find out why, Nell must embark on a dangerous journey to reveal her family's dark history and discover the true power that lies in maps. This novel was a labor of love in more ways than one. Once I'd turned in the final manuscript, 7 years later, I thought that the hard part was done. But in the end, the phantom settlement of Aglow had one more trick up its sleeve for me. While the publisher was preparing the book for printing, my editor and I were discussing graphics because I wanted to put a copy of the actual Aglow map into the text at the spot in the story where the main characters are opening it up and looking at it for the first time. And my editor said, I love that idea. Just send me the information about the map and we'll have the art department hunt down a high resolution copy. I was thrilled. I emailed over the information she'd need for the right edition. And then a few weeks later, my editor called me back. So, she said, the art department can't find a copy of the map anywhere. And we both started to laugh because, as I mentioned in the novel, there's that shadowy, sinister map collector lurking in the background, the one who spent decades buying or stealing every copy of this map that they can until there's only one left, the one in Nell Young's possession. And then it turned out, in real life, over the years, real copies of this map had been disappearing too. Back when I first started looking, you could find them all over eBay or Etsy, or even in the junk section of some antique shops, which is how I originally got a lot of mine, if you remember. And in the meantime, editions of this map had gotten more rare and more expensive over the 7 years, that it took me to collect mine. Maybe because enthusiasts got more interested in the story, or the old paper finally decayed, or some combination. But as I had been writing, prices went up from $5 to $10 to $50 a piece, and supply had gone down until eventually they were very hard to find anywhere. By the time the Cartographers was ready to be published, just like in the story, almost all of them were gone. So I don't know if you can see me right now, or if the screen is if it's too small, but I'm holding up a copy of the book. So if you happen to read the Cartographers, when you reach the point in the story where the map is shown, the image that appears there is actually a scan of one of the copies of a map from my own personal collection, because that was the only one that we could find. And unlike my shady collector character, I promised that I did not break into any libraries or rob any museums, and I certainly did not commit any murders to obtain my copies. But it was kind of funny to experience yet another fiction surrounding this fascinating little map come true in a much less gruesome way, of course. Aglow, this incredible place that started out as no more than a secret on a map, really did manage to become a real town. Eventually, I did get to the truth of what actually happened between General Drafting, Rand McNally, and the Phantom Settlement all those years ago. It turns out, when General Drafting's map first went into circulation, residents of the area where Lindbergh and Alpers had planted Aglow saw this new name on the paper and assumed the local government had established the town for them. They began retitling businesses and revising addresses already in the general area, which then prompted county administrators to record the information. And this flurry of activity attracted new residents, who then built even more buildings and named them after Aglow too. By the time Rand McNally's Cartographers traveled through a year later, they came upon a bustling little village that the residents confidently informed them was called Aglow. And so they put it on their own map as well. The town thrived for years, even becoming somewhat of a tourist attraction for curious cartography enthusiasts once word got out about its strange origins. Until eventually, the residents disbanded for larger cities, and map makers, at last, removed it from their maps for good. But even though there's now only an empty field where Aglow used to be, its legend lives on. In the early 2000s, the Phantom Settlement briefly became famous again because of another book, a young adult novel called Paper Towns by John Green, in which the main characters drive to the site of the Phantom Settlement near the end of the story. For a few years after Paper Towns was released, teenagers and young adults would take road trips out to Aglow to snap photos of the site in a sort of literary pilgrimage. In the beginning, there were still the remains of the long-closed general store of a glow in a field. That building, unfortunately, was torn down a few years ago for safety reasons. So some creative stranger, likely a fan of cartography, or perhaps John Green's book, put up a sign. It was probably meant to be humorous, but visitors loved it. Even though local authorities removed the sign several times, whoever made it kept putting it back up. It became a kind of spiritual marker for a glow. I didn't know if it would still be there. I'd heard that eventually the local government had won out and the sign had been permanently removed. But I still hoped to find some ghostly sign of a glow when I set out to make my own pilgrimage to the site of the Phantom Settlement that took over my life for 7 years. It was a sunny day in the middle of summer. My boyfriend and I brought our dog along for company and rented a car from New York City to make the 3.5-hour drive. We got to Roscoe, which is a little hamlet in Sullivan County, New York, for a late lunch. If you're coming from the south, Roscoe is the last proper settlement you'll pass through before you reach the area where the Phantom Settlement of Aglow was placed on the map. My plan was to do what the characters in my book do, to try to drive to Aglow using a paper map instead of a digital one, since Aglow only appears on paper. So I got out my precious copy of the map, the one that's in the book, waited for a good break in the lazy traffic, and started off at a slow, pleasant speed. I watched the trees go by, the road disappear beneath me, and the distance slowly close. I thought about all the people who drive this quiet country highway, who pass by this Phantom Settlement without ever knowing that it existed. And that if they just looked at the right map of this place, they'd see a different side of it. Using my paper map, I did make it to Aglow that day. And I even found the old sign, badly weathered, beat up by time, but still there, just like the legend behind it. Traditionally, the more accurate a map is, the more powerful we understand it to be. That is, the world is what makes the map real. But Otto G. Lindbergh and Ernest Alpers of General Drafting Corporation achieved something even more spectacular, even if it was by serendipity. Their map made part of the world real, at least for a little bit, and proved that in this day and age, there are still secrets to be discovered within the folds of their pages. And that seems like a pretty good story to me. Thank you so much for listening and for being a part of NACIS. I hope you have a wonderful evening and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you so much, Peng. That was an absolutely fantastic presentation. We have some time for questions and answers. If anyone has any questions they would like to ask Peng while we have her.
That was a wonderful story. Thank you for giving us great background. It makes reading the book so much more enjoyable. My question is, did you spend any other time at the University of Wisconsin or the New York Public Library for the maps that you would look at, and what experiences it was like for you?
Oh, I did. Yes, thank you. The answer is yes and no. The no is that I have not been to the University of Wisconsin to their geography department, but I have been to the map division in the New York Public Library. And it was a really interesting experience writing this book, actually, because I had previously lived in New York before I was writing the book. I had been to the library, and then I moved away, began writing the book, and then the pandemic happened. And so everything got locked down. And I had planned a trip back there to explore the room again and look through the collections to make sure that I had, done it justice. And then suddenly I couldn't travel anymore. And so I spent a lot of time. They have digital archives, and I looked through a lot of those. And then I did manage to get to go back right before the book came out, which was really special to be able to kind of, get there right before publication and see it again.
Thank you for your wonderful talk. My name is Sally and I'm from Austin, Texas. And whenever I'm designing a map, I use the idea of layers, and you have your base map and then you layer on top of that. Do you use that idea of layers when you structure a book or a new story that you're writing? Is that same idea applied at anywhere in your process?
I love that comparison. That I might have to steal that. It was so great. I do. And I used it a lot, especially for this book, because this novel, The Cartographers, started with just the map and I didn't have the characters. And so the first layer was the real history that I wanted to stay somewhat authentic to. And then I finally got Nell, who's the main character. And so she was the first layer. And I actually spent, I think, at least a year or two trying to figure out where the story went from there, because I had this girl and the map and nothing else. And then the second layer was her father, who was the one that had the map. And then on top of that, in the final year, was the fourth layer, which was it's set 30 years before when Nell discovers the map. And it's about the father and his group of 7 friends. And there's something that they discover 30 years ago. They're all cartography PhD students at the University of Wisconsin. And they discover something about cartography 30 years ago. And that secret and the way that they try to keep it is really the thing that set the whole book in motion. But it wasn't until I got to that deepest layer that happens 30 years prior that the whole project really came together.
Both general drafting and Rand McNally's archives are at the Newberry Library in Chicago. And now that this character of the town of Aglow has kind of become a distant cousin to you, I wonder if you've heard of anyone doing any research into the back and forth or the origin story using those archives.
I do remember at one point in my own research, I found copies of, I think, the court case documents, and I don't know where I have them now, but I remember I found copies of the copyright infringement lawsuit, and I mean, that was really fascinating to look through. I wonder if they have that in the archives over there. Might be worth a trip.
Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you so much, Peng. We really appreciated you joining us virtually and pivoting so easily to a remote session. Oh, we have one more.
Share. So I did not know what to expect when I came in here, and I'm excited to read the book, but I will confess I hadn't. But what was really exciting to me is when you showed that map. About 12 years ago, I used to own a house that was about 2 miles from the very bottom of that map.
Really?
If you see, right by Calhoun,
Mm-hmm.
we're a little tiny, I think it's a hamlet really called Coshecton, which doesn't really exist except for about 3 houses.
Mm-hmm.
And it's right next, very close to Calhoun. And I was like, that's my house. That's my phantom town. So I just wanted to thank you. What a exciting surprise.
Oh, no, I love that. Thank you for telling me. Some of my favorite emails to get after the book first came out was I had, I think, at least 5 or 6 people email me and say, I grew up next to a phantom settlement. And then they would send me a copy of, the map where their town was and right next to one. And it was just like the coolest thing to hear these people's stories about, at what age they kind of figured out that there was this other town out there that was not really there. And I'm going to have to go back and look at my map to find your town.
Any other last questions? Okay, I see no hands raised. I'm also short, so if you are raising your hand, please, yes, yell out my name so I see you. All right, thank you again so much. We really do appreciate you making the time to speak with us this evening. And a reminder for all of our audience members that the map gallery is opening next door. If you head out these doors and head to the left, we have a reception as well, and please meet us there. Thank you.
Thank you.